Hello, everyone. As Elizabeth said, my name is April Earle. I am a librarian. I am not a professional genealogist, but I have been working in genealogy and assisting people in their research for a very long time. A little bit about me. I look like I'm spinning around in the sound of music on some hilltop there, but I am actually in a cemetery helping my cousin to determine where her family's plot was. This is often my experience when I go to a cemetery. My family generally does not have headstones. Um, as Elizabeth mentioned, I am an academic librarian. I also teach as an adjunct through St. John's. But how I got started in genealogy was I attended a family reunion for the Losi family, which is my grandpa Earl's maternal side of the family. And while we were there, my grandmother's brother came with his family. And I thought, well, they're not Losi's, they're Henry's. We must have just invited them for sandwiches or something. But my grandmother informed me that her brother, Richard, married my grandfather's cousin, Aunt Jeanette. And I could not get my head around that. And that is what started my genealogy research, trying to figure out how my grandfather was related to my Aunt Jeanette. And as you know, if you've been doing genealogy for a while, every answer you get leads to a dozen more questions. So it has just not stopped in 30 plus years. I just use that plus because that number is never going to get bigger. I figure that that plus is the catch-all for my aging. Um, this here is a photo of my grandparents. My grandmother is seated in the chair there, and that's my grandpa. He's passed. And this is Aunt Jeanette and Uncle Richie. So once I entered graduate school, I decided that I was going to set some research goals for myself. Graduate school is incredibly time consuming, and I felt like I was drifting away from what I loved the most, and that was to do genealogy research. So every year since about 2005, I have set a genealogy research goal for myself for the year. In 2012, I started a blog, which is called Digging Up the Dirt on My Dead People .blogspot.com. It's all one word, digging up the dirt on my dead people. And in it, I write about dead people. I write about stories I've heard, records I uncover, how I found things. Sometimes it's instructional, sometimes it's a narrative, but I only write about the dead. I anonymize my living relatives as much as I can because my dead people are not just mine, they belong to other people as well. And sometimes I cover topics that can be kind of scandalous, and not all my family appreciates outing the skeletons and dark stories of our family's history. Um, the most scandalous character in my family history is Victor Henry II, who is pictured here. Um, he is my great great grandfather. Um, Victor Henrys do not fare well in my family. Victor Henry I, this man's father, died of throat cancer in his mid 50s, and many of his children died very young. Victor Henry II, who I'll tell you more about, had a very scandalous demise. And this man's son, Victor III, drowned in a boating accident when he was only 38. This Victor here died on June 23rd, 1908. He committed a murder suicide. Um, again, my family, not all of them, want to revisit this murder. However, it happened 113 years ago. And if anything, this is the branch of my family that has taught me what it means to be family. So I have no shame in talking about my Henry line and what they have endured through time. Now, his suicide and murder happened the day before President Grover Cleveland died. Had he done this the following day on the 24th, it probably would have never made any news at all. But because he didn't, there are many news articles about it. These are just four that have come from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which is a New York-based paper. This family is based in New York. This here is a photo of Victor again in the corner, along with an image of his wife, Anne Hinch Henry, and his victim, Mary Hinch Cassidy. You'll notice that these two women have the same maiden name in common. They were cousins. Victor murdered Mary Hinch Cassidy, his wife's cousin. The stories are a little shaky, but what I can gather is that Victor was enamored with Mary, who was a recent widow, and she rejected him in some way, and he threw a pistol, shot and killed her, and then turned the gun on himself. That murder-suicide left 4 orphaned Cassidy children, and it left Anne a widow with 3 children of her own. Show you a little bit about Victor's life. So between the time that his father, Victor Henry I, dies in November of 1896, and the time Victor takes his life in June of 1908, there are at least 8 significant deaths that occur in his family. So tragedy is something this family feels all the time. In those 11 years between his death and his father's, he loses his niece, his daughter, a brother, a sister, 2 sons, a brother, and his mother. And just 3-4 months before Victor kills Mary, Mary's husband, James, has died. And so those children of hers, those 4 children, went through the enormous loss of losing both parents. For a long time, I sort of ignored my Henry family research. I didn't really ignore it so much as my father has a cousin, Ro, who we call Aunt Ro, who had done that research since I was a kid. She had been working on that research. And so I sort of left it unexplored. I didn't really copy it. I certainly vetted the documents I linked to my family tree, but I didn't really explore it. And that's a mistake. And I tell my students that all the time. You really want to look more closely at the documents and the things you're uncovering in your family history. This here is a photograph of my grandmother's family, the couple on the right. That's Charles and Anna, my great-grandparents. Charles is Victor, the second son. My grandmother is the little girl seated at his knee. And these are other pictures that we have in our family of Charles. And it's a family that really values its history. So this is my cousin Jennifer, that pretty little lady in the middle there. She developed a project during COVID. She wanted to get her maternal grandparents' names added to an existing stone. So she started to poke around on her mom's side of the tree, not our shared side. And I was showing her some genealogy stuff. And we have these great-grandparents, Charles and Anna, in common. Her grandmother is the girl in between those 2 boys, the taller girl there, that's Aunt Jean. And so her project inspired me to set my 2021 goal. I had this idea that I would visit all the grave sites of all my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, and my 3rd great-grandparents. And I would write about them in my blog. So the first step in doing this project is I looked at my family tree. Now, years before starting my blog, I had one goal that was to find all the names of my direct ancestors back to my 3rd great-grandparents. It is a challenge. Not everyone can do that based on the availability of records. but I was able to do it. I'm very proud of being able to have accomplished that goal. This here is my Henry branch of my tree. So what I did was I looked at all these people and I determined if I had already visited their grave or if I wasn't going to be able to visit their grave. And by that, I mean, you'll see Jane Kavanaugh here, which is Jane Kavanaugh Hinch. She is in gray, which means I probably won't be able to locate her. I don't have a date of birth for her. I don't have an absolute date of death for her. None of my family members do. All I know is that she died in Ireland before the Hinch family came to the United States. So I don't have much hope in being able to find her grave location, certainly not within a year. So some of them were grayed out. But you'll see on my Henry tree alone, I have about 8 here that I needed to find where their graves were. If you do a little math on this goal would lead to potentially visiting 62 grave sites. That includes your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, all of them. That's 62 souls that are responsible for your existence with living parents. And I have a nonagenarian grandma. She's 92. I potentially had 59 grave sites to visit. So I determined that I had already seen 29 of these plots. I'm a genealogist. I go to cemeteries. I've seen a lot of these plots. But that left me about 30 grave sites I had yet to visit. And again, 8 of those were my Henry branch. I then started to collect the locations. I made this spreadsheet of all the 30 graves I needed to locate. I used Google Sheets. If you have a Gmail account, these are cloud-based documents. And there could be a whole program on how to use these, but basically what it means is if I can get online, I can look at this spreadsheet. So it was really helpful. Sometimes I'd be in a cemetery and I'd pull up that sheet for some detail I have recorded. If you have access to Google Sheets, I totally recommend using it for any genealogy project you might have. The next step was to call those cemeteries. Of the 30 graves I had to visit, there are 9 that I am still struggling to locate. Most of them are from my French-Canadian line, and they are likely burials that took place in Quebec. But that means I had 21 unvisited grave sites in my family history. And by locating them, I mean, I thought I knew where each of these graves should be based on death certificates I had obtained or obituaries or family lore. I then had to call each of those cemeteries to obtain the actual plot location. You know, once you're in a big cemetery, it's best to know what section and grave and row and all of that. So I had to call those cemeteries. And you can see I had to call 11 cemeteries to get burial locations. If you look closely, you'll see 6 of those cemeteries are in the boundaries of New York City. I had 1 out in Ohio and 4 here on Long Island, but 6 of those are in the boundaries of New York City. Now, if you're not familiar with the New York metropolitan area, we think of New York City as Manhattan, the little central island to everything. But there are what they call the outer boroughs. So the city is fully comprised of Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and the Bronx. I laid these 6 cemeteries out on a map. You'll see it would only take me 1 hour and 7 minutes to drive from 1 through all 6. So I had this crazy idea that I could do this all in 1 day. The next step was to recruit a companion. And it always helps to have an extra set of eyes. And I recruited my cousin Pete, who is often my partner in crime on cemetery visits. He too has an interest in genealogy, and we share our Henry family ancestry. So I don't know who better to take than cousin Pete. And I had this idea that we could do them all in 1 day. And we did. a little bit about the history of the cemeteries in New York. There is a great website. You might want to write this URL down. It's called the New York City Cemetery Project. Um, it's the work of one woman, Mary French, who is an anthropologist and museum and archives professional who's been exploring New York City cemeteries since about 2006. Her project covers information for over 350 cemeteries throughout the 5 boroughs. They include everything from small family burial grounds and churchyards to larger cemeteries, ones that contain only a few headstones, up to millions of burials. No exaggeration, millions of burials. There is a section between Brooklyn and Queens, sometimes referred to as the cemetery belt. You'll see it here on the lower section of the screen, this green stretch. I zoom in on it a little bit for you. This area, the cemetery belt, is about 2.5 miles of the Jackie Robinson Parkway. Jackie Robinson is actually buried along in one of these cemeteries. He's in Cypress Hills Cemetery. And there are about 15 cemeteries along this stretch of highway in between Brooklyn and Queens. I'm not going to read them all for you, but there's a lot. So why is this? Because in the early 19th century, the island of Manhattan was running out of space for their dead. Bodies were sometimes piled into shallow mass graves, and the stench from it became quite noteworthy in articles. And the abundance of human corpses in the city of New York were linked to the spread of diseases such as typhus and cholera and yellow fever. In 1847, they passed the Rural Cemetery Act, which allowed religious institutions and other entities to buy up these properties tax exempt, specifically for grave sites in underdeveloped areas. And that area between Brooklyn and Queens was ideal for cemeteries because it was terrible farmland. It was very rocky, made it hard for planting. According to a 2017 New York Times article by Keith Williams, he stated that more than 5 million people are buried in Queens County alone. That outnumbers the living by more than 2 to 1. So cemeteries are a big part of Queens. Cemeteries and airports are a big part of Queens. So on Saturday, April 24th, 2021, Cousin Peter and I visited all 6 cemeteries and had lunch in 6.5 hours. Our second stop was at St. John's Cemetery, not St. John's plural, just St. John's Cemetery. We had 4 grave sites to visit there for 5 of our direct ancestors. Our 4th and final grave to visit in St. John was that of our 3rd great-grandfather, Victor Henry I. Tell you a little bit about St. John Cemetery. It was established by the Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn in 1879. It is not the first Catholic cemetery in the Brooklyn Diocese, but it is the largest. Calvary Cemetery, if any of you are in New York and thinking, well, Calvary Cemetery's got to be bigger. Calvary Cemetery is bigger. It is the largest Catholic cemetery, but it's not handled by the Diocese of Brooklyn. It's managed by the Diocese of New York, 2 separate entities. St. John's Cemetery is the location of the main office for all of the cemeteries in the Brooklyn Diocese, including Holy Cross, which is in Brooklyn, Mount St. Mary's, which is in Flushing, Queens, and St. Charles and Resurrection cemeteries, which are located in Farmingdale, not far from where my full-time job is, actually. St. John's Cemetery, ooh, I put an apostrophe S on that, I gotta fix that. St. John Cemetery is located in Middle Village, Queens. It's 190 acres. It's divided into 2 parts. Segments are cut by Metropolitan Avenue. It was consecrated on November 27th, 1881, And by 1895, that northern piece of the cemetery had approximately 32,000 burials in it. There are specific sections that are set aside for burials of diocesan priests. And there are some sections that are dedicated resting places for specific religious congregations. It has some notable interments. Lucky Luciano, John Gotti, Carlo Gambino, Carmine Galante, Vito Genovese, which might indicate to you why it is nicknamed the Mafia Cemetery. It is also the resting place of Mario Cuomo, former governor of New York, Geraldine Ferraro, the female vice presidential candidate from 1984, bodybuilder Charles Atlas, and the very controversial artist Robert Mapplethorpe. But these are my people, and they're in St. John Cemetery. These are my great-great-grandparents' markers. They are Agnes and William Sauer. They are buried there with their children, Agnes and William Sauer. Not real creative with their name giving. This is the final resting place of Victor Henry II's wife, Anne. And this is something I'm familiar with. This is the resting place of my third great-grandmother, Mary Carillion Henry, Victor Henry I's wife. It's a nice azalea bush. Yeah, often my family does not have a headstone. And then our last stop was at Victor Henry I's grave. You see it there? That nice broken thing right in the middle. Peter and I wandered up and down that road of headstones for a while, trying to determine exactly where Victor's stone should be, and we finally settled on it was this broken one. It was a white marble stone broken into 3 pieces. I went out and measured it, and it would, at full height, have been about 4 feet 10 inches tall, which is my height. Which is a little person, but a big stone. It was a really big stone. A monument company went out to evaluate, see if it could be repaired, and it could not be fixed. It was far too brittle, and it really had been worn by the weather. We tried to make out what it said, and we think it was in memory of Victor Henry, died November 9th, 1896, age something we couldn't read. And then there was the name Joseph Henry, and we could make out that was a death in 1902. What I think it said, based on my records, is that Victor would have been 58 years old, and Joseph Henry, his son, would have died on May 30th, 1902, and would have been about 18 years old. So now what? I find this broken stone, and something in me is moved to fix this. In part because my family doesn't often have a headstone. So here we have one that looked like it was significant. I needed to fix it. My first phone call was to my cousin Jenny, who had been working on her own headstone project. She indicated to me that I might need the permission of all the living descendants in order to modify an existing headstone. And that was a process she was going through for another New York City Catholic cemetery. I also called St. John Cemetery, and they gave me a verbal list of all the individuals interred in that plot, as well as a little bit of history on the plot itself as to who purchased it and when it was purchased. But they said they would have to call me back with the procedure, and I would have to pay what they call the back care fee. So while I was waiting to hear back from them, I set about to see if I knew all the living descendants. I know, or at least know of, all of Victor Henry II's descendants, but I didn't know if I needed to know all of Victor Henry I's descendants. So the first thing I did is I went through all the records I had for Victor Henry I. I knew he was born in Switzerland in March of 1838, and that was based on the 1900 census. I knew he died November 9th in 1896 in Woodhaven, Queens, based on his death certificate. I know he died of throat cancer. I know he spoke French. I know he was married to Mary Carillion around 1874, who was also of French descent. And I knew they had 6 children: Victor Henry II, Elizabeth, August, Joseph, Louis, and Stella. I know Victor had had 6 kids, but only 3 had lived to adulthood. August had 2, only 1 who had lived to adulthood. Joseph and Louis did not have any children. They died young. And Stella died at the age of 30, but she had no children. But I realized I had no idea who Elizabeth was. So my next step was to track down Elizabeth Henry. Again, I had never really dug into my Henrys. So I had this chance to find new information. Now, the assumption was that Elizabeth must have died as a child. I see her born in 1876 from the one census she appears in, the 1880 census. Since the 1890 census is gone, she does not appear again with the family in 1900. Now, if you don't know, the 1890 census is gone. It was damaged in a fire that took place on January 10th, 1921 at the U.S. Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. They held on to it for a long period of time, what remained of it, but it was pretty damaged. And in 1933, it was authorized for destruction. And so that 1890 census was destroyed in 1935. And it's a great loss to genealogists. It was a really big, important period of growth in this country, and we don't have that. There's a lot of gap caused by that. In any case, I thought, well, maybe she married before 1900. So I did a search in FamilySearch.org of their collection called the New York City Municipal Death Records for 1795 through 1949. My search criteria, I just put in the first name Elizabeth because I thought, well, if she married, she died under a different last name. They have a field where you can enter a father's name, though. So I put Victor Henry in as the parent. I did a search and I got a record. Result was one record for a Lizzie Dietman in 1876, who died August 9th, 1904. She was from Woodhaven, and she was buried in St. John Cemetery. This is an image taken from Family Search. Show you what that record looked like. A little further research revealed that Lizzie wasn't Dietman. She married Heinrich Dielman in Woodhaven in March of 1893. She had at least 6 kids, but only 1 seemed to have lived to adulthood. And I didn't need to go any further than that because St. John Cemetery called. And they told me I would only need to prove my lineage back to the plot owner, Victor Henry II, my great-great-grandfather. Victor had purchased the plot to bury Victor I in November of 1896. And there were 3 bodies in that plot: Victor, Joseph, and Louis. The information I had about their ages at the time of their death is off from what the cemetery had, but they assured me that that plot was full. When I inquired as to when the stone broke, they told me it had broke in a tornado in 2010, and that they had tried to contact the owner. Both details sounded pretty suspect to me because, one, Victor died in 1908. So how did they try to contact him? I will say that he's not buried in St. John Cemetery, though, so they couldn't have found him in their records. But yeah, he was long dead. And the stone was broken in 2010 by a tornado that ripped through Queens on September 16th, 2010. I had to look it up. So that's the exact date that stone broke. It killed 1 woman, actually, that tornado, when it knocked a tree down and it fell on her car while she was driving on the Grand Central Parkway. It was a pretty bad tornado that I had kind of forgotten about. Tornadoes are not common around these parts, so that should have stood out to me a little more. They told me about the cost. They told me I owed me. I didn't touch this place, and I owed $2,339.50 in back care. So when someone dies and they are buried, there is often an option to pay what is called perpetual care. Well, it's usually a steep cost, and so often a family will opt just to pay the care fee annually. So instead of paying, I don't know, $1,000 in perpetual care, they'll agree to pay the $100 every year. My family obviously did not opt for perpetual care, and I understand that. I did not look to see their records or press them for how they came to that figure, but that is what they told me I owed them. They also wanted me to pay an endowment to cover perpetual care going forward, as well as a $100 fee to have the stone removed, a $165 fee to issue a permit so a new stone could be put in place. Not to mention the cost of the stone would be about $3,000. And I don't know about you, but around here it costs money to purchase documentation, and I would need to prove my lineage back to the plot owner. So the first two questions that really struck me was like, how am I going to pay for this? And then the other one was, if I hadn't been doing this for 30 years, how long would this take me to get this documentation? I just wanted to replace a broken stone, a broken, falling apart, crumbling mess of a stone. The answer to both of those questions is family. You've got to be able to network to get things done. I mean, that's true in life, but it's true in genealogy too. So I reached out to cousin Jenny, who put me in touch with a monument dealer she had been dealing with. Jenny set up a private Facebook group for family members. She created a GoFundMe page to raise money to replace that stone. I reached out to Aunt Roe. Remember Aunt Roe? Been doing this research before me. She supplied me with additional genealogy documentation. I also reached out to St. John's Cemetery and cried poverty. I talked to their Stoneworks division and their accountant, and we negotiated a back care fee. I certainly understand it. You don't make a lot of money in a cemetery once everybody's been buried, and you need to maintain that. So I understood they wanted some money, and I'm willing to pay some, but that was a pretty big number for me. So I also contacted the monument dealer to choose a stone. The private Facebook group is for family members only. Again, you have to be able to network, and social media is one of the best ways to pull a group of people together. This group doesn't accept people who aren't relatives. We posted our GoFundMe link through it, but the group did much more than just raise some money. It brought together people to share stories and images and documents that some of us had never encountered before. Here's a smattering of them. This gentleman in the upper left-hand corner is August Henry, who sort of became the patriarch of the family once Victor had taken his own life. This is August and his wife, much later in life. Some other family group photo at the top, where August is standing in the center of that photo. The image on the lower left of the children, that little girl standing on the left is my grandmother. Jenny's grandma is on the upper right corner, little girl there with a short haircut. And we pulled together some documents about the Dealmans. Our GoFundMe page, I want to stress I'm not soliciting funds here, but I do want to mention GoFundMe because it's a good fundraising tool. It does charge a fee. So I really do recommend that you just have your family send you a check if they want to contribute, or hand you some cash, or use a utility like Venmo. But when you have family who's spread all over the country and they all want to contribute in some way, electronically, GoFundMe is an option. I still have to raise about $2,500 to cover the stone, but I have a little time for that. So we negotiated the back care fee down to $1,950. This included the $750 endowed care fee. The balance owed on that plot is now $1,139.50, which will be deferred until the next grave opening. And since that plot is full, I don't understand why we would ever need to pay that $1,100. But apparently, one can request that they use ground penetrating radar to determine if there is actually space for additional burials in a plot. That's not my intention, but you never know. After I paid the cemetery their $1,950, I was able to then contact the monument dealer to order a stone. And it was the monument dealer who ensures the documentation is in order. I gave them 12 documents: my birth certificate, my father's birth certificate, my grandmother's marriage record showing her name change, her birth certificate, her father's death record, her parents' marriage record, an abundance of documents documenting my great-grandfather's birth, Victor Henry, the plot owner's death certificate, his marriage record, a letter from Catholic cemeteries to my Aunt Ro back from 1983, Victor Henry I's death record. And this incredible document is the receipt for the funeral for Victor Henry I, which took place in November of 1896. I can't find my receipt for the books I purchased last week, but somehow my family has held on to this 125-year-old receipt. Pretty incredible. This document also taught me that there is a difference between casket and coffin. I had no idea. A casket is hinged. A coffin is shaped wider at the shoulders. If you imagine vampires in those coffins, that's them. And then I sent about to select a headstone. The monument dealer gave me thousands of choices. It was a little overwhelming. All I knew is I wanted something that had a prominent cross. That headstone had a huge cross on it. So I asked a few cousins for their input, but ultimately I found a headstone in a cemetery that I really liked. And I sent that photo to the monument dealer and came up with something for me. Now, I did struggle with the epitaph. That's the little piece on the bottom that says some words. Most people go with rest in peace. I figured you could spin around that cemetery and see rest in peace everywhere. So I wanted something different. There's a lot of pray for us. That one on there, Intégralement Pay, is French for paid in full, which I thought was just funny. But it's not paid in full, I guess. We still owe that $1,100 on it. And but you will see in a cemetery that a lot of headstones will say perpetual care, sometimes even engraved on them, but sometimes there's a sticker that shows perpetual care had been paid for that. And that's an important thing to tell your family, that a plot is fully paid for. So this is the stone that I chose on Wednesday, July 21st. I went to the monument dealer and I put a down payment on this. It'll be in gray granite. I was informed that it will take approximately 3 months for the cemetery to approve the design. I don't see what is so controversial about it, except maybe that I didn't put a standard epitaph on it. I decided to go with love your family. My sister thought there might be a need for a comma after love there, as if it is a gift from the family to Victor. But I don't know. I think this is the lesson I've learned from my family. We take care of one another. It was when I paid for the stone that I realized that this broken stone might have been the last significant purchase Victor Henry II made for his family. His youngest brother, who died in 1906, wasn't listed on that stone. So the stone was purchased sometimes between 1902 and 1908 when Victor took his own life. So I don't know. That seemed pretty meaningful to me that I would be replacing that for him. November 9th, 2021 will be the 125th anniversary of Victor Henry I's death. So I'm hoping that the stone can be there by then, because that would be great. So in summary, this process will vary from cemetery to cemetery. It is expensive. But I want to stress that don't forget why you do these things. You do this because you love your family. And with that, I am ready for questions if anyone has them.